The air ducts groaned softly beneath the weight of the mole rats. Each faint creak was a reminder of how fragile their path truly was. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt deafening. No emotion to the team, silence from here on out. Every moment felt like a gamble, the cramped space squeezing the life out of his breaths. The mole rats nodded, watching as their leader moved forward, his palms slick with sweat as they slid along the cold metal. The ducts seemed to constrict with every movement, the walls brushing against his shoulders and knees, forcing him into an uncomfortable crawl. Behind him, the others followed in a single file, crawling every agonizing inch of the way. The dim light filtering through the slats of the ducts painted faint, distorted silhouettes on the walls, shadows that danced around them, mimicking their creeping advance. "Movement below!" A faint voice crackled over the comms, barely above a whisper. One of the team members had spotted something through the slats. Noah froze, his breath catching in his throat. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep moving. They couldn't afford hesitation. Not now. "Eyes forward," Noah hissed. "Do not stop." The memory of SCP-096 loomed large in his mind, a nightmare waiting to be unleashed. Even the faintest glimpse of its face would seal their fate. He knew it was somewhere below them, prowling the labyrinthine corridors of the facility, its grotesque form lurking just out of sight. A sudden clang echoed through the ducts, distant but unmistakable. The team stopped, rooted to the spot. The sound stretched their already frayed nerves. Noah's pulse quickened, his heartbeat a deafening drum in his chest. His eyes darted wildly through the oppressive darkness, searching for the source of the noise. But the shadows refused to yield any answers. "Move!" Noah snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. The team pushed forward, inch by painstaking inch. The ducts seemed to narrow even further, the metal walls scraping against Noah's shoulders with each movement. The effort was exhausting. His muscles screamed with every pull forward. The clang sounded again, but this time, it was closer. Everyone was still. They waited with bated breaths. Nothing. They looked to Noah to give them the signal to keep moving. He was frozen. "Captain?" one of the mole rats whispered. "Should we keep?" Noah cut them off, giving a sharp signal to move forward. His nerves were on edge. Claustrophobic spaces were not his forte. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a junction. Noah paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with a shaky hand. His wrist-mounted map glowed faintly in the darkness, the light casting eerie shadows on his face. "Next sector is close," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "We'll drop down here. Stay sharp." Noah peered through the grate below. The corridor below was cloaked in deep, shifting shadows that hinted at unseen secrets. It looked empty, but the silence made it feel alive. He took a deep breath and gestured to the others. One by one, they descended, their boots landing softly on the floor below. The air in the forgotten sector was thick with dust. The mole rats had to stifle their coughing fits. Each breath felt heavier than the last. The walls around them were lined with peeling paint, their surfaces streaked with dark, unidentifiable stains. Dangling wires swayed gently in the stagnant air. It felt like a place that time and everyone else had forgotten. "Captain?" one of the mole rats called softly. They motioned toward a section of the wall. "You need to see this." Noah approached, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. His eyes narrowed as he examined the wall, its surface cracked and uneven. Something about it felt wrong. He extended a hand, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. A shiver ran up his spine as the walls seemed to hum faintly at his touch. A low vibration that was almost imperceptible, but undeniable. "There's something here," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. The mole rats hung back, their unease palpable as Noah continued his inspection. With a sharp tug, he dislodged a panel, the rusted metal groaning as it slid away to reveal a dark, recessed compartment. Inside, shrouded in dust and shadows, something glinted faintly in the dim light. "What the hell is that?" one of the mole rats whispered. Noah didn't answer. He was already stepping forward. Something was pulling him in, something he couldn't explain. His eyes locked onto the object in the compartment, a mechanical suit, its surface dull and pitted with age. It was SCP-5000, but it wasn't empty. A figure was slumped inside the suit, its form twisted and grotesque. The body's flesh had fused with the interior mechanisms, strands of muscle and tissue becoming one with the gears and joints. The head hung at an unnatural angle, the face partially obscured by the helmet. What little was visible was pale and bloated, a macabre reminder of whomever had worn the suit before. The mole rats recoiled, murmuring uneasily. Noah ventured towards it. "Noah!" one of them stated, but his name barely registered. He was drawn to the suit, the sensation growing stronger with every step. The air around it seemed to pulse, alive with strange energy. Noah reached out, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the cold metal. "It's waiting for me," he whispered, the words escaping without thought. As his fingers made contact, the hum grew louder, resonating through his body. The suit almost seemed to respond, its surface warming faintly beneath his touch. Without hesitation, Noah began to pull the body from the suit. The process was grisly, the remains definitely clinging on, as though the suit itself refused to let go of its hold. Bloodless tissue stretched and snapped, releasing wet, sickening sounds that bounced around the chamber. The mole rats watched in stunned silence as Noah pried the body free of the suit. Each movement was methodical, unrelenting, determined. Finally, the suit was empty. Noah tossed the remains to the side as if they were garbage. Before anyone on the team could voice their objections, Noah slipped himself into the suit. The fit was perfect, almost as though it was made for him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, everything changed. Holographic streams of data exploded before his eyes, cascading in vivid bursts of light. His senses were catapulted into overdrive. Every breath, every faint creak of the facility became deafeningly clear. He could hear the mole rats breathing, the hum of distant machinery, even the subtle shift of the infected terrain around them. His vision sharpened, the dim of the room suddenly bright and vivid. "Noah, what's happening?" one of the mole rats finally managed to ask, their voice laced with panic. Noah couldn't respond. The suit was binding tighter with each passing second, its systems fusing with him. Threat markers appeared in his vision, mapping potential dangers with chilling precision. It was overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. I can see everything," Noah murmured, his voice hollow and mechanical, as if spoken from somewhere far away. The faint glow of the suit cast distorted shadows on the pulsating wall. "We need to keep moving," he added, the command cold and clipped. The group pressed on, the mole rats following their leader with a mix of duty and reluctance. The walls around them felt alive, throbbing in time with the grotesque infection of SCP-610. They seemed to breathe, their pulsating surfaces glistening with a sickly sheen. Fleshy tendrils spread like veins, crawling over every surface, writhing faintly as if responding to the group's presence. Noah led the way, his enhanced vision cutting through the darkness like a blade. The suit's interface was relentless, feeding him a constant stream of information. Structural weaknesses mapped themselves onto his vision, distant heat signatures blinked faintly in the corner of his eye, and subtle shifts in the infected terrain appeared as warnings. Structural collapse possible ahead. The suit chimed softly. Noah made a sharp gesture, signaling the team to adjust their path. "Boss, isn't this where the Hammerdown team was?" one of the mole rats dared to ask. Noah ignored the question. He kept moving. He had to keep moving. The team followed him without further questions, casting anxious glances at each other. Then, it happened. A sound that sent a chill rippling through the group. A sickening squelch reverberated through the tunnel, wet and visceral. Something was tearing free from the walls. It was faint at first, but then came again, louder, closer. "They're here," Noah said, his voice devoid of emotion, more an observation than a warning. Ahead, the shadows moved. At first, they were slow and disjointed, but as they stepped into the faint light of the team's weapons, the true horror started to emerge. The zombified remains of the Hammerdown team lurched into full view. Their bodies were grotesque amalgamations of armor and infection. What had once been tactical gear was now fused with the pulsating organic growth of SCP-610. Limbs jerked unnaturally, like broken puppets controlled by unseen hands. Faces were stretched and bloated, their features twisted into horrific parodies of humanity. From their mouths came guttural, unnatural sounds, a mix of groans and gurgles that filled the narrow space. "Contact!" one of the mole rats yelled, raising their weapons, their voice cracking under the weight of fear. "No," Noah's voice cut through the tension. "Hold your fire. I'll handle this." Before anyone could protest, Noah activated the suit's stealth system. His form shimmered, then vanished, melting seamlessly into the shadows. The faint hum of the suit faded as he disappeared, leaving the team standing in silence. "What's he doing?" one of the mole rats whispered, their grip tightening on their weapon. The others looked at each other, panic and fear etched on their faces, but they held their position, their nerves fraying as the infected soldiers shambled closer. Noah moved like a ghost, his steps silent and deliberate. Through the suit's interface, the world was laid bare. The infected figures were overlaid with tactical data. Weak points in their armor glowed faintly. Movement patterns traced themselves in fluid arcs, and vitals flickered as faint pulses of light. His first strike was swift and came without warning. From the shadows, Noah emerged, a blur of motion as he closed the gap to his first target. The infected soldier jerked violently as Noah's blade, a sharp extension of the suit's arm, pierced the base of its skull. The grotesque form crumpled silently to the ground. He vanished again before the others could react, moving with a speed and precision that seemed inhuman. Another infected soldier staggered, its helmeted head twisting unnaturally as Noah struck with brutal efficiency. One by one, he incapacitated them, each takedown executed with cold, surgical precision. The mole rats could do nothing but watch, their weapons trembling in their hands as their captain became something else entirely, a predator stalking the remains of their former allies. The last infected soldier turned, its movements almost hesitant, as if it sensed the inevitability of its fate. Noah struck from behind, his blade slicing cleanly through the twisted mass of flesh and armor. For a moment, the cave fell silent, save for the faint squelch of infected bodies collapsing to the floor. Noah reappeared, his suit's faint glow casting eerie light over the carnage. "Clear," he said, his voice as cold as the suit's metallic sheen. The mole rats stared at Noah, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Noah stood in the faint glow of the suit, his form impossibly calm amid the carnage that surrounded them. This was no longer the leader they had followed through countless missions. There was something different, something alien. The team huddled against the walls, their weapons lowered but still gripped tightly, fingers hovering over the triggers, wary of another attack. Is it over?" one of the mole rats finally whispered with a trembling voice. Noah didn't answer. He stood apart, still and unnervingly calm, completely untouched by the ordeal. And then, another faint squelch, subtle, blending in with the ambient sound. Noah's head snapped toward the source, his enhanced vision catching movement in the corner of the room. The twisted bodies of the zombified hammer-down team, which had fallen mere moments ago, began to stir. Limbs twitched, fingers clawed at the infected ground, and hollow groans escaped from the warped remains of their throats. "They're waking up," Noah said flatly, his voice carrying no panic, only cold observation. "What?" one of the mole rats blurted, their voice cracking as their gaze darted to the reanimated forms. "How?" "They're not alive," Noah replied. "You can't kill what's already dead." The groans grew louder, swelling into a haunting symphony. The zombified bodies convulsed as they began to rise. Armor creaked, fused flesh tore, and the hollow, glassy eyes of the infected soldiers locked onto the team. "We're leaving," Noah ordered, his voice sharper now. "Through there?" A mole rat gestured toward the narrow tunnel leading out of the chamber. "Now," Noah replied, already moving. Reluctantly, the team followed, casting nervous glances behind them as the zombified soldiers rose to their feet. The sounds of the infected hammer-down team echoed through the caves, growing louder, hungrier, as the mole rats slipped deeper into the tunnels. The air grew colder with every step, the damp humidity of the caves giving way to a biting chill that clawed at their skin. Their breaths turned to mist, visible in the dim light as the tunnel narrowed around them. Suddenly, a low, guttural wail echoed faintly through the passage. It started as a whimper, almost mournful, but quickly grew into something raw and more bone-chilling. The mole rats froze, their blood turning to ice at the noise. Noah turned sharply, raising his hand in a quick signal. "Be still," he commanded. "Close your eyes. Now." The mole rats exchanged panicked looks but obeyed, their eyes squeezing shut as their hands gripped their weapons tightly. The wailing grew louder, its pitch rising as it moved through the tunnels. The air seemed to thrum with tension as SCP-096's cries grew closer. A faint shuffle echoed behind them, followed by the distinct shape of something dragging across the stone floor. The sound drew nearer, deliberate and searching. Noah stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing controlled. The faint hum of the suit was the only indication of his presence. SCP-096 entered the space, its movements erratic yet purposeful. The creature's gaunt, elongated frame twisted and jerked as it swiveled its head, its hollow eyes scanning the group. Its breaths were labored, rasping, each exhale a harsh, guttural sound that sent shivers through the mole rats. It moved among them, its presence heavy and oppressive. The creature leaned down, its face mere inches from one of the soldiers, its breaths brushing against their cheek. The soldier didn't move, their knuckles white as they gripped their weapons. For a moment, the only sound was the creature's breaths and the pounding heartbeats of the team. Then, it happened. One of the mole rats, overcome by a mix of terror and curiosity, opened an eye just for a second. But it was a second too long. SCP-096 snapped its head toward them. Its wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a guttural snarl that shook the air. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged. The mole rat let out a strangled cry as SCP-096 descended upon them, its bony hands tearing through flesh and bone. Blood sprayed in violent arcs, painting the tunnel walls in crimson streaks, while the wet, grotesque sounds of tearing flesh and cracking bones sliced through the darkness. "Keep your eyes shut," Noah barked. The remaining mole rats obeyed, trembling as they gripped their weapons even tighter. The carnage ended as quickly as it began. SCP-096 let out a final guttural snarl before the sound of its shuffling footsteps receded into the distance. Minutes passed like hours, the silence in the tunnel stretching thin and taut. Noah opened his eyes first, his enhanced vision sweeping the space. The remains of the fallen soldier were unrecognizable, torn apart in a frenzy of violence, but SCP-096 was gone. "Open your eyes," Noah commanded. One by one, the mole rats complied, their expressions pale and haunted as they took in the aftermath. Noah didn't wait for their questions or their fear to take hold. "Move," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for hesitation. The team followed, their steps heavy and reluctant as they trudged forward. Ahead, the faint light of the cave mouth glowed like a beacon of hope. When they emerged, the cold slammed into them. The wind roared across the Siberian tundra, carrying with it a swirl of snow and ice that stung their exposed skin. The sky above was a dull gray, stretching endlessly over a barren, frozen wasteland. The landscape felt as lifeless as the infected they had just left behind. "It's freezing," one of the mole rats muttered, their voice barely audible over the howling wind. They pulled their jacket tighter, their gloved hands shaking as they adjusted their gear. Another turned in a slow circle, their expression tightening with frustration as they took in the vast emptiness around them. "Where are we even supposed to go now?" they asked, their tones strained, anger barely masking their fear. Noah stood apart from the group, his back to them as he scanned the horizon with the suit's enhanced sensors. The faint glow of the suit created an otherworldly aura around him, its light pulsating against the backdrop of the desolate tundra. "We're heading back to the outpost," Noah said, his voice steady despite the chaos of their surroundings. "To what?" another mole rat snapped. "We'll be exposed out here to the cold, to SCP-096, to everything." Noah turned slowly. The glow from the suit obscured his face, but the intensity of his gaze was palpable. SCP-096 will not follow us, he said, his tone carrying an edge of finality. The mole rat squared off with Noah, inches away from his face. And how can you possibly know that? Noah just stared at him, no hint of emotion on his face. He gestured back toward the cave. From within, faint echoes of movement and guttural groans reached them. Because the last one of us who saw its face is gone, he said flatly. SCP-096 doesn't hunt the dead. The weight of his words settled over the group. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the relentless howling of the wind. This is insane, one of the mole rats muttered. Fear and exhaustion was fueling dissent among the team. They glanced at the endless tundra ahead, then back toward the cave. We can't survive out here, we're sitting ducks! Noah's visor tilted slightly, his attention shifting briefly to the suit's interface as it chimed softly in his ear. Heat signatures blinked faintly on the horizon, distant, but not far enough. Then stay, he said coldly, his tone devoid of empathy. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking. The mole rats paused, the tension rippling between them. The man who had led them through countless missions, who had once inspired unwavering loyalty, now seemed like a stranger, more machine than human. To stay meant facing the infected, now fully awakened in the caves behind them, or SCP-096, whose pursuit would surely never end. One by one, they followed Noah, their movements slow and reluctant. The icy wind bit at their faces. It offered no shelter, no solace, and no promises of survival. Ahead, Noah trudged forward, his figure barely visible against the endless white expanse of the frozen landscape. The wind whipped around the mole rats, carrying with it biting shards of ice that scraped against exposed skin and settled into the folds of clothing. Each step felt heavier than the last. The snow beneath their boots crunched faintly against the deafening roar of the elements. The horizon offered no landmarks, no hope of refuge, and yet the mole rats still followed Noah, their movements sluggish and labored, their breath visible in short, sharp bursts. Time lost meaning in the cold. Minutes felt like hours, each passing moment a test of their endurance. Days had passed since they'd last eaten anything substantial, and their reserves of energy were all but gone. One of the team members, a grizzled veteran with a deep scar running across his jaw, slowed his pace and reached into a pocket. With trembling hands, he pulled out a small ration pack, hardly enough to sustain a single person, let alone the entire group. Yet without hesitation, he began breaking it apart, dividing the brittle, frozen fragments of food into smaller pieces. "Take this," he said, his voice rough but kind, as he handed a small portion to each of his teammates. The others nodded their thanks, their faces etched with gratitude and exhaustion. When he reached Noah, he paused for a moment before extending the last sliver of the ration. "Captain," he offered quietly. Noah didn't stop. His pace didn't falter, nor did he turn to acknowledge the gesture. The faint glow of the suit was the only sign of his presence, an eerie beacon against the desolation. "I don't need it," Noah said, his tone flat, devoid of any inflection. The man lowered his hand, his expression darkening with unease. He quickened his pace to fall in step with Noah, his breath catching in the frozen air. "What exactly is that thing doing to you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he studied the suit. Noah didn't answer immediately. His focus was elsewhere, his mind consumed by the relentless stream of data pouring into the suit's interface. "I'm fine," Noah said at last. But he wasn't. The mole rats exchanged uneasy looks, their captain's words doing little to reassure them. The suit had become an extension of him, and with every step, it pulled him further from the people he had sworn to protect. His thoughts were no longer his own. Decisions that had once been tempered by instinct and humanity were now filtered through the cold logic of the suit's programming. "Hold here," Noah commanded suddenly, raising a hand. The team stopped, huddling together for warmth as the freezing wind tore through their gear. Noah stood apart, his head tilted slightly as the interface fed him new information, the chime of its updates punctuating the roaring wind. As they waited, Noah delved deeper into the suit's memory banks. The encrypted logs unfolded before him, their contents a dark mirror reflecting truths the Foundation had buried. Images flickered in his vision, entire cities consumed by fire, civilians torn apart by SCPs unleashed under the guise of containment, Nations plunged into chaos. Each scenario was meticulously calculated, every disaster serving a hidden agenda. Names surfaced in the data, shadowy figures orchestrating global crises from behind the scenes. Their motives were painted in greed and power, their decisions justified by cold, ruthless logic. The suit offered no judgment, only facts, but the weight of the revelations pressed down on Noah like an avalanche. His breath caught in his throat. The frozen air burned as he exhaled, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Captain?" one of the mole rats asked, their voice tentative, taut with concern. The truth Noah had uncovered was too vast, too damning to put into words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We've been lied to." The words hit the team harder than the cold ever could. They exchanged wary glances, the unease between them deepening. "What are you talking about?" someone pressed, their tone equal parts fear and frustration. Noah didn't elaborate. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, the suit's glow reflecting the storm brewing within him. "We're not pawns," he muttered, his voice trembling with a quiet fury that burned against the icy winds. Without another word, he began to walk. The mole rats said nothing, their silence heavy with unspoken questions. They trudged on, their captain leading them deeper into the frozen expanse.